He had no fixed face. Literally, surgeons had changed it, more than once. He had no fixed address. He never slept anywhere 2 nights running. He had no phone, no email, no radio, nothing that could be traced, tapped, or triangulated. For 25 years, he was hunted by 6 intelligence services at the same time. And for 25 years, he simply wasn't there when they arrived. Western agencies called him a terrorist mastermind. His own people barely knew what he looked like. The press, when they dared write about him at all, gave him a nickname that stuck for a generation, the Ghost of Damascus. He planned attacks that killed more Americans than any other man before September 11, 2001. He helped force 2 Western armies out of a country they'd occupied by force. And for 2.5 decades, he did all of it while remaining almost completely invisible. Then, on one ordinary night in Damascus in 2008, the ghost stepped outside, walked to his car, and made the one mistake that ended it all. This is the story of the longest manhunt in the history of Israeli intelligence, how Mossad found a man who had made an art form out of not being found. To understand how this manhunt happened, you have to go back to where it started, not in some secret bunker, but in an ordinary village in southern Lebanon in the early 1960s. He was born into a modest family, the kind of household with no political connections and no particular ambition beyond getting by. Lebanon at that time was still, on the surface, a relatively stable place, sometimes called the Switzerland of the Middle East. But underneath, the country was a pressure cooker. Different religious communities were jostling for power. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees had been living in camps inside Lebanon's borders since 1948, and by the 1970s, those camps had become recruiting grounds for armed factions. As a teenager, he was pulled into that world. He joined the Palestine Liberation Organization, specifically an elite unit known as Force 17, which functioned as Yasser Arafat's personal protection detail and did far more than just stand guard. Force 17 ran intelligence gathering operations, moved weapons, and carried out targeted strikes. It was, in a sense, a training academy for the exact skills that would define the rest of his life. How to case a target, how to disappear after an operation, how to build a network of people who trusted you without ever fully knowing who you were. By his early 20s, colleagues would later say, he had already absorbed the central lesson of clandestine work, one that most people in his line of business never fully learn. The most dangerous man in a room isn't the one who can fight the hardest, it's the one nobody can identify afterward. In 1982, everything changed. Israel invaded Lebanon to push the PLO out of the country, and Arafat and his fighters were forced into exile. But he didn't leave. He stayed behind, and almost immediately, a new organization began forming to fill the vacuum. Iran, fresh off its own 1979 revolution and eager to export its influence, sent Revolutionary Guard trainers into Lebanon's Bekaa Valley to build a Shia militant group from scratch. That group would become Hezbollah. He didn't just join it. Within a few years, because of his training and his instincts for secrecy, he was effectively running its security apparatus and directing its most sensitive operations, all while remaining, by design, a man that even most Hezbollah members had never met and couldn't identify. So what did this man actually do? Because the list, once you lay it out, is staggering. April 1983, a truck packed with explosives slammed into the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. 63 people died, including 17 Americans, among them, the CIA's entire Middle East station chief team. It remains one of the deadliest single attacks on American diplomatic personnel in history. 6 months later, October 1983, 2 truck bombs hit almost simultaneously, one at the barracks housing U.S. Marines, another at a nearby French paratrooper barracks. 241 American servicemen died. 58 French soldiers died alongside them. It remains, to this day, the deadliest single day for U.S. Marines since the Battle of Iwo Jima in World War II. Within months, both the United States and France withdrew their forces from Lebanon entirely. A relatively small, poorly resourced militant group had just forced 2 of the most powerful militaries on Earth into retreat, and intelligence agencies on 3 continents began attaching one name to the operation. He wasn't finished. Over the years that followed, he became the architect of a hostage-taking campaign that snatched journalists, academics, and businessmen off the streets of Beirut, including the CIA's own station chief, William Buckley, who was tortured in captivity for over a year before he died. In 1985, he's believed to have orchestrated the hijacking of TWA Flight 847, a 17-day hostage ordeal that ended with the murder of U.S. Navy diver Robert Stetham, whose body was dumped on the airport tarmac in front of news cameras. By the mid-1980s, he was, by any measure, one of the most wanted men alive. The CIA wanted him. The FBI wanted him. French intelligence wanted him for the deaths of their own soldiers. And Israel, which had been watching Hezbollah grow more capable and more lethal every year, had concluded that this one man was the linchpin holding the entire organization's operational capability together. The problem was, nobody could find him. How does a man stay hidden from 6 of the world's best intelligence services for 25 years? It wasn't luck. It was discipline, applied with an almost obsessive consistency. He altered his appearance surgically, more than once. Any photograph on file was, within a couple of years, essentially useless. He could walk past an agent who was actively looking for him and not be recognized. He avoided electronic communication entirely. No phones, no radios, nothing that could be intercepted by the increasingly sophisticated signals intelligence networks the US and Israel were building. When he needed to pass a message, he used human couriers, trusted people carrying verbal instructions or handwritten notes that left no digital trace at all. He never established a pattern. He didn't sleep in the same location on consecutive nights. He varied his routes, his vehicles, his routines. Intelligence work runs on pattern recognition, habits you can predict and eventually exploit. He gave his hunters nothing to work with. He compartmentalized himself almost completely. Most rank-and-file Hezbollah members never saw his face or knew his real name. He operated through layers of intermediaries, which meant that even if one of them was captured and interrogated, they had nothing to give up, because they genuinely didn't know where he was. And he stayed inside protective territory. Hezbollah controlled Lebanon, and later Syria under the Assad regime functioned as sanctuaries. Both governments had every incentive to shield him from Western intelligence, and both made it extraordinarily risky for foreign operatives to move freely on the ground. The Americans came close more than once. In the 1980s, intelligence suggested he'd be aboard a specific flight out of Paris. A plan was drawn up to force the plane down and capture him. At the last moment, he wasn't on board. In 1994, he was reportedly aboard a boat in the Mediterranean. A strike was considered, and then scrapped as too risky. Each time, the ghost simply wasn't where he was supposed to be. Mossad's closest call came in 1994. Intelligence had tracked him to a specific apartment building inside Lebanon. A strike was prepared, but somewhere along the way, something broke down. Whether he was tipped off or simply got lucky, no one has ever confirmed. When the operation was carried out, he wasn't there. His own brother was killed in the strike instead. He escaped, once again. For Israeli intelligence, this was devastating. It also taught them something crucial. He had sources inside their own operational chain who could warn him. Whatever they did next would need to be slower, quieter, and far more careful. He responded to the near miss exactly as you'd expect. He retreated even further into the shadows, altered his appearance again, and cut contact with almost everyone connected to his earlier life. For the next several years, he became, functionally, a ghost even within his own organization. But history has a way of applying pressure that no amount of caution can fully absorb. After September 11, 2001, the entire global intelligence apparatus reoriented itself around hunting terrorists, and while Osama bin Laden was the headline target, he wasn't forgotten. The CIA director at the time reportedly called him a bigger long-term threat than bin Laden, given his track record, his skill set, and his backing from a state sponsor in Iran. Then, in 2006, Hezbollah launched a cross-border raid into Israel, sparking the 34-day Second Lebanon War. Israeli jets pounded targets across Lebanon. Hezbollah fired thousands of rockets into Israeli cities. When it ended, both sides claimed victory. But what stunned Israeli military planners was how disciplined, well-trained, and well-defended Hezbollah's forces had become. Someone had built that capability. Israeli intelligence knew exactly who. After 2006, finding him stopped being a priority. It became the priority. Here's the thing about hunting a man like this. You can't just get lucky once. You need a pattern, a moment, however brief, where you can be certain he'll be in a specific place at a specific time. And for 25 years, he'd given his hunters nothing. The breakthrough, when it finally came, didn't come from a satellite or an intercepted phone call. It came from a human source, someone recruited years earlier who had, slowly and carefully, gained proximity to people in his inner circle. Not close enough to know his location day to day, close enough to know what events he might attend. In late 2007 and into early 2008, that source began reporting something new. He was spending noticeably more time in Damascus. On its face, that made sense. Syria, tightly controlled by the Assad regime, and allied with both Iran and Hezbollah, had always functioned as one of his safest havens. But there's a strange psychological trap that comes with feeling safe. People get comfortable. They let their guard down, just slightly. That's exactly what intelligence analysts began to suspect was happening. Surveillance narrowed in on an upscale, diplomat-heavy Damascus neighborhood, the kind of district where unusual comings and goings might not draw much attention. One building in particular stood out, an Iranian cultural center that quietly doubled as a meeting point for Hezbollah and Iranian officials. Analysts began watching who came and went, waiting for the one piece of confirmation they needed. It arrived in the form of an anniversary. In early 2008, Damascus was preparing to mark the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution, the kind of event where senior Hezbollah figures might reasonably show their faces, even briefly. Through intercepted communications and human sources working in tandem, Israeli intelligence pieced together a confirmation. He would attend a gathering in Damascus on the evening of February 12, 2008. Knowing he'd be somewhere in Damascus that night wasn't enough. Operatives needed to know exactly where he'd be, down to the minute, and they needed a method of elimination precise enough not to miss, and deniable enough not to trigger an open diplomatic crisis with Syria. A missile strike risked collateral damage, and an unmistakable signature, pointing straight back to Israel. A car bomb, by contrast, could plausibly be attributed to any one of the dozens of enemies he'd made over a 25-year career of violence. It was chosen as the method. According to multiple accounts, this was a joint operation between the CIA and Mossad, reportedly one of the most sensitive collaborations between the two agencies in years. American technical expertise is said to have gone into building a remotely detonated device with an extremely precise trigger. Israeli operatives, working with local assets on the ground in Damascus, handled the on-the-ground tradecraft, identifying the specific vehicle he would be using that night, a Mitsubishi Pajero, and placing the explosive device inside the headrest built into its spare tire, mounted on the rear of the vehicle. Whether the device had been in place for weeks or was installed just hours before the operation is still disputed. What's not disputed is what happened next. On the night of February 12, 2008, he attended the gathering exactly as predicted. By most accounts, he was relaxed, even in good spirits. A man who had spent 25 years being hunted by the best intelligence services on the planet and had, every single time, walked away. Maybe, after that long, some part of him had started to believe he actually was untouchable. Around 10:30 p.m., he left the event and walked to his car. He got in. He prepared to drive off into another quiet Damascus night, the same routine he'd repeated thousands of times before, in dozens of cities, across a quarter of a century. Then, the device detonated. The explosion was massive but contained, destroying the vehicle and killing him instantly. After 25 years of evasion, after the surgeries, the couriers, the vanishing acts, the near misses, the ghost never even had time to know what was happening. News of his death rippled across the region almost immediately. Hezbollah initially refused to confirm it. When they finally did, the group's leadership vowed retaliation. Iranian officials called it an act of war. Syrian authorities opened an investigation into a killing that had happened, humiliatingly, inside their own capital, and never named a culprit. In Washington and Tel Aviv, officials offered no public comment, but privately, there was quiet satisfaction that one of the most capable operators either government had ever tracked was finally gone. Hezbollah held a funeral that drew thousands of mourners. Its leader delivered a speech promising that Israel would pay. That, in his words, no Israeli target anywhere in the world was now off limits. For a time, the fear of major retaliation was very real. Some analysts have connected a handful of later attacks, including a 2012 bus bombing in Bulgaria that killed 5 Israeli tourists and their driver, and a foiled 2013 plot in Cyprus, to lingering efforts at revenge. But the large-scale retaliatory strike Hezbollah promised never fully materialized. Some analysts argue that's because his death genuinely crippled the group's most sophisticated operational capabilities. He was, quite simply, that difficult to replace. Even now, key details of the operation remain murky. How deep was the CIA's direct involvement, hands-on planning, or purely technical support? How exactly was the bomb installed on a vehicle presumably guarded by both Syrian state security and his own protective network? And why February 2008, specifically, after 25 years of failed attempts? Was it simply the first real opportunity, or were there other strategic calculations in play? Intelligence agencies rarely explain their own operations, even decades later. and the people who could answer these questions have every professional reason to stay silent. Step back from the operational details for a moment, because this case is studied in intelligence courses for reasons that go well beyond one man's death. First, it proved that no one is permanently untouchable. He did almost everything right for 25 straight years. Surgery, discipline, compartmentalization, patience. In the end, none of it mattered, because his hunters were even more patient than he was. Second, it demonstrated the real value of intelligence cooperation. The CIA-Mossad relationship has never been simple. There's a long history of mutual suspicion and competing priorities. But on this target, both sides set that aside, combined American technical capability with Israeli operational reach, and accomplished something neither agency could likely have pulled off alone. Third, it reaffirmed something technology keeps threatening to make people forget. Human intelligence still matters most. All the satellites and signal intercepts in the world couldn't locate him. What finally worked was a human being, embedded close enough to hear about an anniversary reception months in advance. Of course, his death didn't dismantle Hezbollah. The organization kept growing, deploying thousands of fighters into the Syrian civil war, continuing to expand its rocket arsenal, remaining a dominant force in Lebanese politics. If anything, the threat Hezbollah poses today, in terms of raw military capability, is arguably larger than it was in 2008. Killing one man, however central, was never going to resolve a structural, decades-old conflict. But it's also true that every year he wasn't actively planning operations was a year those operations simply didn't happen, and that counts for something. There's an ethical debate worth acknowledging honestly, too. Targeted killings like this one are controversial for real reasons. Critics call them extrajudicial executions, carried out without trial, with real risk of killing the wrong person or fueling further cycles of violence. Defenders argue that in cases like his, conventional law enforcement was never a realistic option. He operated for decades inside states that actively protected him from any form of arrest or extradition. Reasonable people land in different places on this question, and that debate isn't going away. One more detail is worth sitting with. In the months after his death, investigators pieced together something unexpected about his final years. Despite the paranoia, despite the layers of security, he'd apparently been living something closer to an ordinary life than anyone assumed. Spending time with family, attending gatherings, quietly trying to hold on to some version of a normal existence inside the world he'd built for himself. That doesn't excuse a single thing he did. Every one of his victims had a family too, wanted a normal life too, and never got the chance. But it's a strange, almost uncomfortable footnote to the story that the desire to simply be present at a celebration, to be part of a community rather than permanently invisible, may be the very thing that finally let his enemies find him. 25 years of tradecraft, patience, and near misses on both sides. And in the end, it came down to something almost painfully human. A man who, after a lifetime of hiding, wanted just one night of feeling ordinary. That night in Damascus, it cost him everything. If you made it this far, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.